We're going to continue our unit on the central nervous system with the spinal cord. So in the last section of the lecture, I talked about this idea of meninges, and they are these protective layers of membranes which surround the brain. But one thing I also want to make sure that we all understand is that they also surround the spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal So if you look here, you can see that the brain and spinal cord are actually one unit. So the brain and spinal cord are connected to each other. You have to think of the spinal cord essentially as a tail coming off of the brain, but that is how the brain communicates with the body. So the one thing I want to point out to you, I know this is very sloppy looking, but you can see we have our layers, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. They surround the brain, but they also travel all the way down the spinal cord and surround the whole thing. So that's not the best picture in the world, but you get the idea. So if you take a look here, if I look at my image on this diagram, you can see that the pia mater would be right here on the actual spinal cord, and then we have the what's going to be considered the arachnoid mater would be right in this area, and then this would be our dura mater right here, which is protecting the whole thing. So the spinal cord travels down the vertebrae. So when you think of the vertebral column, it's made up of all these individual vertebrae, which we talked about in the skeletal unit, and those individual vertebrae have certain characteristics which give them the ability to protect. So if you take a look here, this represents the bone, so this would be the vertebrae. So right down the center of the vertebrae is going to be this opening called the vertebral foramen, and that allows the spinal cord to travel down the vertebrae to the base of the spinal cord. So you can see here I have my vertebral column, and then the actual spinal cord travels down the vertebral column and it sends out its little spinal nerves out to the body. So there's a couple things that protect the spinal cord. It's going to be the vertebrae and then also those three meninges which protect the brain as well. There's a space that exists between the actual bony part. So this would be the bone here. That's the actual vertebrae, and the actual spinal cord. There is a space there known as the epidural space. Now, you've probably heard of an epidural before. That is an injection that can be used to basically numb a person from that point down. So a lot of times when women are giving birth, they'll get what's called an epidural injection, where they go into the space between the vertebrae and the spinal cord, and they inject an anesthetic there. And what that does is it numbs the body from that point down. But in this epidural space, so this is the epidural space here, it's between the dura mater of the spinal cord and the bone of the vertebrae. So that's what this says. It's between the vertebrae and the dura mater. And what's going to be in here is you're going to find blood vessels, and there's also going to be some tissues in there for protection. But basically, that's just an open space, and they take advantage of that in order to inject an anesthetic. Let's talk a little more about the spinal cord and the components that make it up. So there's 31 segments of the spinal cord, and the spinal cord itself gets broken into spinal nerves. So each segment has a spinal nerve coming off of it. So if I go back to my little model here, if you can see it, you can see right down the middle of this vertebrae here, you can see the spinal nerves are coming off. So each one of these spinal nerves is coming off of one of those 31 segments. And those spinal nerves go out to the body, and they innervate muscles, and they innervate glands and organs. And basically, the whole point of the whole spinal nerve here, the whole spinal cord, I should say, is to communicate with the brain and the body. The brain really is just sitting in the cranium, completely separate from everything going on in the body, and the spinal cord is the only way it has to communicate with the body, and that is why when it gets cut, if someone's injured, it causes paralysis, and it's such a big deal when that happens, because now the body can no longer communicate with the brain, and a person cannot move their muscles or move different body parts. So it allows two-way communication between the brain and the body. There are two main functions of the spinal cord. One is that it's the center for reflexes, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. Reflexes are really interesting. Reflexes are something we cannot control. We do not control our reflexes. And then also it conducts impulses to and from the brain, and that's the stuff that we can control. So let's talk a little bit more about it. A little bit of anatomy. The beginning point of the spinal cord is the foramen magnum, and that is the opening in the base of the skull. So if I go to the skull here and I look at the base of the skull, I see there's a big open hole here, and that is called the foramen magnum, and that is the opening at which the spinal cord exits the cranium. So that is where the spinal cord comes from. That is considered the beginning of the spinal cord at this point. The ending point is known as the conus medullaris, and the conus medullaris is about the L1, L2. So that does not go all the way down, and that's pretty interesting about your spinal cord. It actually ends right about here. And then there's an extension coming off of it, which comes off the bottom, which has a special name called the cauda equina. So the cauda equina is this extension coming off of the base of the spinal cord where you have connective tissue, but you also have nerves coming off of that. So they do extend, and cauda equina means horse's tail. Equina means horse and cauda means tail. So the reason why they call it that is because it looks kind of like a horse's tail coming off of the end of the spinal cord. So we have our beginning point, which is the foramen magnum, and then we have our end point, which is the conus medullaris, and then continuing off of that, we have what's called the cauda equina, which extends down all the way down, and that's where the nerves come down to the lower part of your body. A little more about the spinal cord. So if you take a look here, this is a cross section of the spinal cord. So we're looking at it, it'd be like if I cut the spinal cord this direction and we're looking down on it. So we're now looking down the spinal column. And what you'll notice here is that the spinal cord actually has two sides to it. It's split in the middle, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But one thing I want you to notice is there's white matter and there's gray matter. And hopefully you now remember from our last unit that has to do with myelin. So the white matter is the myelinated neurons going up and down the spinal cord, and then the gray matter are the unmyelinated portions which communicate from side to side. So there's names for them. They call the gray matter the horns, and if you take a look, it looks kind of like horns. They also refer to the gray matter as the butterfly, so you'll hear me refer to it as a butterfly, but also they're known as the horns. And there's the anterior horn up front, so this is the front of the body. This is the anterior part of the body. This is the posterior part. So the anterior horns are up front, and the posterior horns are in the back. And then the white matter has a name. It's called funiculi. So the white matter is known as the funiculi, and we'll refer to it as we go through. There's also some grooves that you're going to see in the spinal cord that's separated into two sides. And there's one on the front and there's one on the back. In the back, this is called the posterior median sulcus, and then the front is the anterior median fissure. So there's two sides to the spinal cord, just like there's two sides to the brain. There's a right and a left hemisphere of the brain, and there's a right and a left side of the spinal cord. And what separates them? In the back, it's the posterior median sulcus, and in the front, it's the anterior median fissure. The difference between a sulcus and a fissure is larger, so you can see it's a little bit deeper here. How do you remember that? Well, if I'm sad, I want to sulk, and if I want to sulk, I don't want to be in the front of the room. I want to sulk in the back of the room where no one can see me. So the sulcus is in the back, posterior median sulcus. It's sulking in the back. So that's just a way to remember it. But the sulcus is going to be posterior, and the fissure is going to be anterior. And this is just some terminology and some anatomy you need to know. I'm going to keep going through here, and then we're going to finish up for this part of the lecture. So the central canal, actually there's an opening going straight down the middle of your spinal cord. So you can't really see it in this diagram very well, but in the middle of this little, I guess you would call it butterfly here, the gray butterfly, there's actually a hole. There's an opening which goes straight down the middle of the spinal cord, and that is where cerebral spinal fluid travels down. So cerebral spinal fluid actually travels down the spinal cord, straight down the middle, and then it comes back up the sides. And we're going to talk more about that in another lecture. But for now, you just need to know that there's an opening which travels down the middle of the spinal cord, which is called the central canal, and it's full of cerebral spinal fluid. So think of a jelly donut, right? A jelly donut, you got jelly in the middle. Well, the spinal cord has a middle as well, and it's an opening that goes straight down the middle called the central canal, and it's full of cerebral spinal fluid. And then the last thing I want to point out on this slide is there's actually a name for this connected area as well. So we have our right and our left sides of the gray matter. Well, there's a name for this little area in the middle. It is called the gray commissure. And the gray commissure just connects the wings of the butterfly. It connects the right and left side. It allows the right side of the spinal cord to communicate with the left side of the spinal cord. So just a quick review of what we talked about up to this point. We have our posterior median sulcus, our anterior median fissure. We have our horns of the gray matter, the anterior and the posterior horn. We have the funiculi of the white matter, and we have our central canal going right down the center. And then finally, we have our gray commissure. One more thing I want to point out to you is the sensory information is coming in the posterior side. So this is information coming in from the body. And then the front side, the anterior side, is the motor information going out. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And that is what I wanted to cover on the anatomy of the spinal cord.